Hi, and welcome to Chapter 9. In this chapter, we're going to look at how cells communicate with one another. So there are 4 categories of cell signaling, and the first one is known as paracrine signaling. Paracrine refers to neighbors, so these cells are going to be very close to each other. And the signaling molecules will move by diffusion, going from high to low concentration, through the extracellular matrix, because again, we're looking at cells that are talking with one another, that are communicating with one another. So this will be a type of intercellular signaling between 2 different cells or 2 or more different cells. And these examples include synaptic signals, such as from a neuron to another neuron or from a neuron to a muscle, as well as the transmitters, the neurotransmitters that are the signaling molecules between the 2 types of cells. And the picture from our textbook, paracrine signaling, is shown here. And remember, in paracrine signaling, we're looking at neighboring cells, where a cell is going to release signaling molecules to an adjacent or nearby cell. Here it looks like signaling cell, or cell A, is releasing these signaling molecules that bind to the receptors of our target cell B. So a really common example of paracrine signaling is either between 2 neurons. Let's pretend this is neuron 1 and this is neuron 2. Or this could be a muscle cell, which is also a very common pathway between 2 neurons or between a neuron and a muscle cell that the neuron controls. The neuron or the cell that is releasing the signaling molecules is called the presynaptic cell in this case. And the neuron or cell or muscle that's receiving the signal is called the postsynaptic cell. And the signal, once it's transmitted from the presynaptic to the postsynaptic cell, that signaling process is called a synapse. And that's why these are called pre- or postsynaptic cells. Again, because these cells are very close together, there is not much distance for these signaling molecules to travel, and they travel through rapid diffusion. For the postsynaptic cell, whether it's a neuron or a muscle, it has to have some kind of receptors that bind to and respond to the signal. And again, eventually, you want the signal to stop. You don't want your cell to continually respond or be on all of the time. So sometimes we have to have enzymes that eventually break down those signals so that the signal can stop and does not resume until the next set of signaling molecules is released. Our second category of signaling is endocrine signaling. And endocrine signaling is different from paracrine signaling because we're traveling long distances this time in terms of our signaling molecules. So cell 1 that's releasing the signaling molecules will be far away from cell 2. And in order for the molecules, those signaling molecules, to reach cell 2, they usually have to travel through the blood vessel. So these signaling molecules will enter the blood, travel until they ultimately reach their destination. Since they have to travel such a long distance, these molecules will really decrease in concentration by the time they reach their final destination. And this also tells us that the cells that are responding to the signals have to have very specific receptors that bind to and respond to the signals. Otherwise, everything else along the way might accidentally respond to the same signaling molecule. Usually this results in a slower response because of that long distance traveled, but with longer lasting effects. And hormones are part of this process. Endocrine signaling is depicted down here in our textbook. Again, the cell targets a far away cell, a distant cell, and it sends signaling molecules through the bloodstream, through the blood vessels, before these signals reach the target cell. Hormone signaling and a closer study of the endocrine system will be examined in Bio4B, the next course in the series. But just to give you an example of how far some hormones travel, during the stress response, if you're stressed out, One of the things that happens is in your brain, there are some glands that will release hormones into the blood. And one of these hormones includes something called adrenocorticotropic hormone. And that will actually travel all the way from the brain down to the adrenal glands to stimulate some kind of stress response. Our third category of signaling is called autocrine signaling. And this is kind of interesting because this is self-signaling, where a cell will release a signal, and that signaling molecule will actually bind to the cell that released it to cause some kind of response in the cell. In other cases, there are signals that are released and bind to something similar to the original cell, and that causes either activation of the cell or cell death signaling. And autocrine signaling is depicted up here, where the cell targets itself. And this is going to be popular if you ever study immunology, how our cells called B cells or T cells activate themselves upon seeing something foreign in the blood. And we'll see this is true for cells that undergo apoptosis as well, or programmed cell death. Finally, our fourth and last category of signaling is direct signaling through gap junctions. So a while ago, we looked at the different types of junctions that connect cells, and one of them were big pores, these large channels that connect cells and allow small molecules to pass between cells very quickly. That one is shown here, signaling across gap junctions. Gap junctions are shown here. So the cells are pretty much attached to each other and connected through these gap junctions, which look like giant channels or very large channels, and anything that is small enough to pass through the channel from cell 1 to cell 2 acts as a signal connecting those two cells. One of the most popular examples of gap junctions are what I've mentioned before in previous lectures, the gap junctions found between our cardiac muscle cells. So if we were to zoom in on the heart muscle, we would see that gap junctions connect our heart muscle cells, and they allow ions to travel very quickly between cells. This is important in the heart because it allows cells to contract all at the same time. So your heart beats as a unit instead of little cells beating one at a time, which would cause fibrillation or abnormal heart contraction. All right, so what can happen when a cell receives a signal? What's next? These are some of the things that can happen, but it's not a comprehensive list. We'll talk more about this in future chapters. But some of these responses include gene expression. So having a cell receive a signal can indicate that it should activate some of the genes to make different proteins required in the cell. Another response could be to increase or decrease the cell's metabolism. So, for example, glycolysis or the Krebs cycle or the electron transport chain could speed up, or it could be inhibited. Other responses include cell growth, so the cell could increase in size, such as during mitosis or cell reproduction. And then cell death is also a possibility as a result of receiving those signals. For example, if something is wrong with the cell, it might release an autocrine signal to tell the cell to destroy itself before the mutation or damaged cell is spread or is replicated. All right, so that's the end of the first video. In our second video for chapter 9, we're going to look at the receptors that bind to these signaling molecules.